Hello, hello. We're going to get started. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for our Haymarket Presents conversation with Leanne Simpson and Wahike Mele. My name is Jim Plank. I'm the publicity director at Haymarket Books. I want to thank our co-sponsors for this event, Pilsen Community Books. They're at the table in the back. If you haven't already gotten Leanne's beautiful book, Theory of Water, you can get a copy from them. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that Haymarket House events take place on the occupied lands of the Council of the Three Fires, Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi. These indigenous keepers of the land were forcibly removed through acts of genocide and dispossession. We recognize the nations that live in and around Illinois, and we stand in solidarity with them in their ongoing struggles for justice. We also acknowledge that settler colonialism is not relegated to history, but continues today, as we bear witness to and protest the genocide in Gaza at the hands of the Israeli state with the full backing of the U.S. state. We stand in solidarity with all those around the world resisting imperialism and the devastation of global capitalism. We're living in challenging and frightening times. Coming to terms with the systems of racial capitalism and colonialism that are at the root of the violence and destruction around us can help us chart a path forward in our struggles for collective liberation. That liberation may feel like a distant horizon right now when we're facing so many attacks in an uncertain future. But looking around this room, I'm buoyed by all of you who are here, both familiar faces and new ones, who have made time to come together in community and in conversation. We keep us safe. We are the ones who are the makers of a new world and a more just world. So thank you so much for being here, for supporting Haymarket and Haymarket House, and for all of your work outside of these walls in our collective struggles for justice. And now to introduce our speakers who you're here to see. Wahike Mele is a Kanaka Maoli scholar, organizer, and practitioner from Maunawili on the island of Oahu. He's assistant professor in the Department of Race, Diaspora, and Indigeneity at the University of Chicago. Mele's research interests include history, law, and activism on Hawaiian sovereignty, indigenous critical theory, settler colonialism, political economy, feminist and queer studies, and decolonization. And Leanne Simpson is a Mishisagig Nishnaabeg scholar, writer, musician, and artist. She holds a PhD from the University of Manitoba and teaches at the Deshinta Center for Research and Learning in Dunedin. As an independent scholar using Nishnaabeg intellectual practices, Leanne has lectured extensively at universities across Canada, the United States, and beyond, and has over 20 years of experience with Indigenous land-based education. She's the author of 8 books, including 2 that Haymarket had the honor to publish, Rehearsals for Living, which is also at the back, a collaboration with Robin Maynard, and Theory of Water, which we're here tonight to discuss. So I'll hand it over to Wahike and Leanne.
Aloha. As a Kanaka Maoli person, as a Hawaiian person, I'm going to start with a mo'olelo, or a story. They say that we're good storytellers, so let's see. It's a story of Leanne and I meeting at a sacred waterway in Toronto, also known as Takaranto. More than 2 years ago, Leanne was actually giving a conversation at the Women and Gender Studies Institute at the University of Toronto, where I formerly worked, with Robin Maynard to discuss the book that was just mentioned, Rehearsals for Living, which was fantastic. And the conversation with you and Robin was brilliant and lovely. A true model for what you write about is sintering in retrospect, but also what that was a rehearsal. And we met, at Zibing Lab, which was and continues to be a research lab on Indigenous internationalism at the University of Toronto, and it's located at a sacred waterway known as Zibing. It's a Nishnaabeg Muen word that describes being at or near a river, creek, or waterway. It's one of these unremarkable creeks that are in urban spaces, which Leanne references in the book, Theory of Water. And we talked about grounded solidarity and relationality with my friends and staff, Sardana Nikolaeva, who's Saha from the Arctic region of Russia, was my postdoc at the time, and Joanna Lewis, who was an undergraduate student, Palestinian, and we talked about what it meant to relate to each other in your territory in Toronto at a unremarkable urban creek that was built on top of to actually create the infrastructure and housing for the city of Toronto to flourish and boom as it did. But it was also built on top of by the University of Toronto. Nevertheless, we were there. Nishnaabeg, Kanakamauli, Saha, Palestinian, talking about dreams for liberation, talking about ways forward, talking about rehearsing life differently. And it was a beautiful meeting that I'll never forget. In fact, I think I went home to my partner who's here and was like, oh my God, Leanne came to the lab and we talked about Zibing Lab and everything. And there were two things that I really remember. The first was that there were folks in your community that talked about the importance of seeing Zibing recognized at the university. And the second was you knew that you needed a Hawaiian to come and upset shit. I'll never forget those things. So fast forward, and this is in the summer of 2023, 2 years ago, in the midst of Al-Aqsa flood, Leanne, Glenn Coulthard, Nick Estes, and myself started talking about how to mobilize our own people in solidarity with Palestinians fighting for their liberation, fighting to get free, not just from an open air prison in Gaza, but all across Palestine. And so we started talking about Indigenous solidarity for Palestine. We put together a statement and we got people to sign on. We did a podcast, and the podcast, the statement, our relations that we were building together were beautiful because they were important. And nevertheless, most of us were lambasted. I know Glenn was during a talk at U of T. There was a public smear campaign against me. Nick Estes is Nick Estes, for Christ's sakes. He's a dear friend of mine. Then at the American Studies Association conference in Montreal, November 2023, I could barely even travel. I could barely even attend panels, but I did attend a panel with Leanne. And she and I talked after the panel, and she said, I'm so sorry that you got death threats on my territory. And she gifted me a beautiful light blue colored kufia from Hebron as a gift. And it's this kufia. And I cried because of how meaningful it was to me, but also because of the necessity to continue building and to continue working and striving for freedom and liberation altogether. So tonight I've gifted Leanne a kukui nut lei. And for Hawaiians, kukui nut is significant because it represents the fueling of fire for the pursuit of knowledge. And this book, like Leanne herself, is illuminating, much like the kukui nut creates. And I hope that tonight can be a light for us in what can feel like an incredibly dark and unprecedented moment, such that we are all here in Chicago, in the Nishnaabeg territory, with Leanne to celebrate this book and also to talk about Theory of Water and Nishnaabeg maps for the times ahead, for the times of the past, and for the time of now. So how'd I do?
Mahalo. Mahalo miigwech. Ani kinuaya, gitagabaju na denawema, Nishnaabeg ogaming na tonjaba, na gojawani megwa doda, Betasamosake Simpson. I'm so happy and honored to be here with you all today on the shore of Michi Gaming in Shigakong. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you all for coming. And thank you for our origin story. I remember you had really good snacks in the Zeeving lab. It was impressive snacks.
Yeah. Is that U of T money? I wanted to start our conversation with a question about art and music. You are a poet, a musician, a writer, so many things. But there was one line in the book that really struck me that I wanted to ask to open us up. And so in the book, you talk about art and song, of which artists and musicians offer alternative possibilities, but also prayers. So could you talk a little bit about how you see this book, Theory of Water, as both offering alternative possibilities in the here and now, which can feel overwhelming and unprecedented and awful, in your role as an artist crafting this book, but also as a musician, what prayers are you offering?
I think it can be really, really difficult when you're in a present moment like ours, be dreaming and visioning. It's a privilege to have the resources and the time to be able to vision and dream something other than what we're facing right now. And so I think looking back to my people, this act of dreaming and visioning was really important. It was kind of collectivized. Everybody had their own gifts around. There's people that were sort of in charge of envisioning a future that would be profoundly about systems of care and caring for each other and caring for the land and waters and all of the living things that we're sharing time and space with on this planet. And so sometimes in settler colonial societies and in contemporary societies, that work falls to writers and to artists and to musicians, sometimes children, and people that can imagine something different than the world that we've inherited. And I think that it's really important to have people that can do that work and that can raise the bar and that can imagine beyond, because I think within Nishnaabeg thought, it's that first imagining and dreaming that can become the inspiration and the fuel for the making. And so artists and writers who are, I guess, aligning themselves with our origin stories, our making stories, are kind of reenacting that every day. And so I know in moments like this, it can be really, really overwhelming and really difficult to find the energy to be able to do anything other than just critique or confront or fight or shut down. But I think all the time, this dreaming and expanding our collective possibilities is beautiful work. And I see that work as sort of prayers in many, many different forms.
Mahalo for that. There is a undercurrent, many, in fact, I think, in this book that you've crafted for us to engage with, and one of them is your music. So, Theory of Water was inspired by Theory of Ice. Could you talk about that album? It isn't necessarily a passing moment in the text, but it is one that's purposeful, and I think that it helps to contextualize at the same time what you're telling us about the prayers that you're offering here.
This is one of the weird things about my practice, and one of the ways that I don't fit very well into the academy, because Theory of Ice, the record, really was the first bit of research that I did for Theory of Water, the book. And so I had the experience of being on the land in the north of Canada in Danende at my land-based educator kind of job with the Chinta. And I was able to spend about 6 weeks on the shore of a lake that was freezing, and then again 6 weeks on the shore of a lake that was breaking up. And so I saw this miraculous transformation from a deeply frozen environment in minus 40 in February to finally later on in May being this spectacular lake with all kinds of different life teeming on it. And so that transformative process got me thinking about water. And up until that time, I had been, like many Indigenous academics, I had been very focused on land, because land is very, very important to us, and land is our, that's who we are. And this experience of spending time at the shore, well, this relative of mine, this lake, was going through this miraculous transformation, this metamorphosis that it does twice a year, whether I'm there or not, all over the place, made me think differently about the way that I was living and the world that I was living in. And it got my attention. It got me thinking about water. I continued that thinking with water, listening to water, sitting at the shore, believing in water, to use Dion Brand's work, into writing this book. And the original draft of this book was quite a bit more academic. It was more of an academic text. It was similar in tone to Rehearsals for Living. And then Dion Brandt was the editor in Canada, and all of that part got chopped right up onto the editing floor. And she felt that I was hiding behind the footnotes and the endnotes, that I was hiding behind the academic literature, and that I wasn't finding my voice. And because she's kind of the best writer in the world, and I was just so lucky to be working with her, I listened to her. I feel like if it had been some like dusty old white lady, I would have been like, yeah. You would have had another, as we have always done. But I really listened to her and edited that part out. And so this book was born. But I think I had to do that work of writing those poems first with the lake, and then writing those songs, and then touring around those songs and rehearsing them and singing them like a billion times alone in my bedroom, and then with my band, and then at band practice, and then on tour, as a methodology for generating this book, which is not like, you can't do that with your dissertation. Probably. Maybe if you're the professor.
I think you bring up an excellent point that you talk to in the book about leaving academia. So there's an irony that's not lost on me with what you just mentioned, which is that this early draft was overly academic. There was a response that you were hiding behind footnotes. And nevertheless, there is an important lesson that we can learn, I think, from how you combine both those tools of genealogy, let's say, in relationship, in citational practice, or sharp cutting analysis and theorizing, with the work itself outside of the neoliberal academy, outside of the universities that have shown what some might think are their true colors now, but we've always known them to be this way. So could you talk a little bit about your experience in the academy, why turn away? What are your thoughts currently about academic institutions, maybe even on your own territory, and how you relate to them, the people that work there, the students?
They were so mean to you. um, I feel like, first of all, I am a dork nerd through and through. And so I actually do really love scholarship. And I, as you can see, like as much as I've quit it and turned away a number of times, I also turn right around back to it because there's something I think that is really valuable in critique, in deep thought, in coming together and engaging in scholarly work, particularly when it's done in community and particularly when it's done with organizers and artists and parents and people that we're sharing our neighborhoods with. So I think that's the first thing to say. I think evidence of that in this book is, you know, dorky me in the the pandemic volunteering to groom the ski trail in the mornings on a snowmobile in my local park, listening to Robin Kelly on a podcast and getting the idea of centering. So I think that um, I think that I want to say that first. I think that I came up through the academy in the 1990s. I was often the only Indigenous student in the classroom. I didn't have Indigenous mentors. My first two degrees were in science, which was, I obviously didn't have like a career counselor either because I was a poet in science, and that wasn't super successful in that. And then I did a PhD in interdisciplinary studies at the University of Manitoba. But again, if you think back to the 1990s about the canon of work that was written, there was very little written by Indigenous people. There was very little written at all. Um, and so I spent a lot of time in community. I spent a lot of time on reserves, on the land with elders, and learning that way. And I really fell in love with that work. And so it made sense. It felt like me. It made me happy. It made me feel inspired. And that really has been the spine of my work, whether it's artistic work, whether it's writing, whether it's teaching, or whether it's scholarship. And I think that love of Anishinaabe land and water and old people and children and being with my people and doing our land-based activities is something that's really filled me up, and I've been lucky enough to be able to figure out a way of putting that at the center of my life.
If you don't already know about the Chinta, which is a accredited educational institution that is located in Yellowknife, does land-based education. Leanne, you are a co-founder and current ED extraordinaire, keeping the boat afloat. It's an incredible institution, place of gathering. I've been able to have been asked to visit, and I wasn't able to, unfortunately, at the time. But I do hope that one day I get to visit because it is very clear to me how significant it is, not just for the local Dene community, but also for the ways in which Indigenous peoples, communities, and nations see a important model for doing that type of land-based work that is valuable and redistributes resources and trains artists and activists and does research. So I do want to acknowledge that it's incredible, and it also in Theory of Water was a point of consternation for your elder Doug Williams, because he says something to the effect of, "You're doing all this work over there. Why not here in your territory?" Can you talk about that, but more specifically, your relationship with your elder, Doug Williams, who the book is dedicated to, how he, as an elder, and his teachings, but also his scholarship. This is Our Territory, I believe, is the name of his magnum opus, it sounds like. How he and his teachings, inclusive of that text, permeate you and your teachings for us in this text?
Sure. So after I I got my PhD at the University of Manitoba, I moved back to my home territory. I got a job at Trent University, primarily because I knew they were going to pay my travel expenses for moving home. And Doug was one of the elders that was working at Trent at the time, and I was moving there because I really wanted to learn from people in my own territory, my own Michisagi knowledge. So Doug and I, we hit it off. We had the same sense of humor. We had sort of the same political leanings. He had he was from Curve Lake First Nation. He was a hunter. He ran a sugar bush. He was a ceremonial leader and a language speaker, and had a really huge body of Nishnaabeg knowledge. He had that huge body of knowledge because he spent a lot of time with his two uncles, Madden and McCons. McCons means bear cub. And those two old ones had a lot of knowledge because they were very, very good at escaping the truant officer for the day school. And so they would run away from the day school, which was a kind of residential school in Canada, and they would spend a large amount of time in the bush with their uncles. So those two little boys, because they hated school and because they had a lot of fire and resistance in them, preserved for us this huge body of knowledge that Doug inherited and that Doug passed along to me and a whole bunch of other people in our communities. So I think that is a pretty spectacular thing. Um, Doug was a great storyteller. I have two kids who are now adults, but they were homeschooled, and so we were able to just spend a lot of time together on the land with multi-aged learners, harvesting wild rice, running the sugar bush, looking for moose, all of these kinds of things that became um, a really important body of knowledge for my work. So I wouldn't have the body of work that I have without this 3-decade long mentorship. Doug knew I was writing this book, and he passed away when I was writing it. He lived till he was 80, and so there's also a lot of grief in the book. And there's also, for the Indigenous folks in the audience, when an elder dies, you're not just losing like a parent, friend, grandparent, mentor. There's this huge body of knowledge that you also lose. And there's this fear that you didn't pay attention good enough, you didn't remember it good enough. And so I think a lot of time the voice in this book is me sort of having conversations with him that I can't have anymore, me trying to remember everything that he taught me and get it down. But writing, a lot of this writing was in the wake of that kind of first year of grief. He was very supportive of me going north to Dechinta, and when Glenn Coulthard, probably almost 15 years ago, invited me to come into his community to do this work, I was like, why would you invite like an Anishinaabe person from the South? Like, how desperate are you for professors? Like, I can't teach these people anything. But what I did learn, and I learned it through Doug, was how to go and live and work in someone else's territory and embody Anishinaabe diplomacy, ethics, and how to be a visitor in a good way. And so Doug was sort of very supportive from that end of things, because the Dene have an incredible amount of fairly untouched land. We were able to take small groups of students, so maybe 10 Indigenous students at a time, out of the land for anywhere from a week to 6 weeks with their families to live together as a community. The students and their kids would spend half the day with the elders learning land-based activities, and then half the day sort of with us talking about colonialism and dispossession and gender, and making, I think, deepening the students' understanding of what was happening with the elders. But I think the real work in that program is actually the same kind of work that happens with organizers at blockades, that happens in these moments where we have to figure out how to live together in a good way. So the real education is who's going to cut the firewood, because you have to cut a lot of firewood in the north. Who's going to get the water? How are we going to repair relationships when there's conflict? Who's going to do the dishes? Who's doing childcare while other people are doing dishes? So all of these kinds of decisions that I think our ancestors were very, very good at making, because they were very good at repairing and being accountable and practicing consent in relationships. We end up doing a tremendous amount of work. Because the biggest barrier to post-secondary education in the North was childcare for Indigenous women, everybody brings their kids. We're super attentive to trying to remove barriers, any kind of barriers to post-secondary education. So we provide economic support, we provide wellness support, we provide childcare, housing, meals, and then this sort of experience, this immersive experience of living together on the land. So we've been doing this work for 15 years now, I think. We've got programs in Nunavut, in Yukon, and a couple of different places in the Northwest Territories. And so students are able to earn 5 credits from the University of British Columbia. We thought that would be like a basis of admission, or that they would go and get degrees in the South. No one wants to leave the North or their home or their communities. So a lot of people just get their certificate and then go and do community organizing work in their own communities. But it's also been a struggle. It's really difficult to fund. It's really difficult keep going. And I think that Doug sort of saw that as one of the closest educational models to sort of a Nishnaabeg education model. Yeah, so I think he was always like of two minds, like why you need to be home and you need to be doing this work at home, but also sort of appreciative of what we were doing in the North.
I think that the kind of exchange that you're describing, even if we could call it that because it's so much more capacious, we might also understand as a practice of Indigenous internationalism, which is a concept and a practice that you've written about, in my opinion, fairly extensively across things that you've published. Theory of Water being one, but also As We Have Always Done, and I believe more too. When we hear internationalism, and here we are at the Haymarket, we might think of the Communist Internationals meetings. We also might think of the kind of post-World War II Wilsonian self-determination moment that provided the conditions for the international world system as we know it and the UN. Like these two things might come to mind when thinking about internationalism. But Indigenous internationalism is not that. It is not the United Nations. It is not the Communist International. It's something else that is grounded in our territories and our worldviews and our relationships with other Indigenous peoples. Can you speak to what you see Indigenous internationalism in your view? Maybe other examples of how you see it practiced today, whether in Canada or elsewhere, here in the United States or elsewhere.
So this afternoon, I went down to the lake, to the beach, because it's a short walk from here, and I was sitting at the shore, which for Anishinaabe people, Madiwitang writes, is a place where we learn about consent and accountability, because it's a place of overlap. You have the land world, you have the water world, and you have the sky world. And so it's a place of internationalism. It's a place where 3 completely different worlds converge and generate life. I was also thinking that I was, at the shore of this lake that's part of the Great Lakes that connects me to my homeland, that connects to countries, a whole bunch of states, a whole bunch of provinces. It's home to 3,500 different species. It's this incredibly rich, diverse place that we all belong to. And I think Anishinaabe thought teaches us that life is a network of living things across time and space, and that our job is to weave ourselves or knit ourselves into that network in a way that doesn't destroy life, in a way that isn't the death machine of capitalism or colonialism or fascism. And so, this weaving ourselves into the existing natural world in a way that is, I think, in solidarity with species and different cultures who are different than us, is the way that our people lived. And I think that is the way that I look at internationalism. It's that we share a planet. Our job is to care for that planet. Our job is to, in diverse ways, knit and weave ourselves into this fantastic planet. In Anishinaabe thought, the Great Lakes are the internal organs of the planet, the place that cleans, the place that renews, the place that filters. And so we're in a really, really powerful spot here together on the shore. And I think in this book, I wanted to be attentive and I wanted to pay attention to those teachers at the shore, which in this book was water. I wanted to think and collaborate with water and the embodied practice of water. And I'm late to the game as an Anishinaabe because our women have been walking around lakes. And holding the responsibilities and ceremonies for water for generations and generations. But I think that internationalism looks different because it's not based on the nation state. And the Anishinaabe Nation is not based on borders that one protects with police and armies. It's not based on that nation state formation. It's based on this deep relationality. And so looking back at my own nation, we're an ecotone of two overlapping ecologies that produces this abundance of knowledge and abundance of species. Parts of our territory overlap with the Wendat or the Huron Nation. Parts of our territory overlap with the Haudenosaunee. And those areas of overlap require sort of an increased relationality. They require more care. They require more attentiveness to make sure that we're all getting along. But I think that sort of that form of internationalism is something that is a refusal of the colonial state and of things, kinds of internationalism that are based on those nation states and their interests. And it's one that I think is also extremely local. Because Anishinaabe people, I don't think of our territory as our territory. We already know that we're sharing it with frogs and snakes and water and air and moose and beavers and the Haudenosaunee and the Wendat. Everything is always shared.
The idea of situating or landing or locating without destroying in good relationship is, in the most simplistic terms, centering for you in this book, which is a fantastic contribution, I think, for thinking about all sorts of things, theoretical and also practical. And you name it early on as a method of solidarity. But it's also a method of relating. As the snowflake drops and meets with snow and ice on the ground, it bonds and centers, and that bonding is centering this process ecologically. You also refer to it as a process of mutual aid, in addition to non-interference, non-denomination, and for world building. So it's so capacious, really diverse and meaningful for thinking about all sorts of things. So I want to think with these areas with you in relation to centering, because I think it will help to build bridges between what you're really richly giving us in this text and with the idea of centering that you intimately learned while listening to Robin D.G. Kelly at the same time. And maybe we can think about how, first, in the vein of Robin D.G. Kelly and other Black radical intellectuals and Black feminists that you cite, I imagine the meeting with Andrew Ritchie in the South Pacific every time I finish this book. Like this is a type of centering with people, but also with thought, right? The book is a theory of water. So could you talk a little bit about the centering of Indigenous and Black thought in this book?
So I think people in Chicago know about snow, right? We know that it can be incredibly powerful. It can force a strike it can arrest capitalism, and we all have to stay at home because it's a snow day. We also know that that if you don't get out and shovel the snow as soon as it stops falling and you wait till the next day, that you're going to have a trickier job because the snow is heavier because it has center. So I was, during the pandemic, volunteering to groom my local ski trail. I'm listening to, I think, The Dig as a podcast while I'm grooming, because that's what all groomers do. And I'm thinking a lot about snow. I'm thinking a lot about snow because it's becoming really precious where I live, because we get less and less of it every year. The season of winter gets shorter and shorter every year. That's devastating for Nishnaabeg people, because that's where we tell stories, and that's where we tell our big theoretical sort of foundational stories. So I was sort of spending time thinking about what I could learn from snow. Doug had died, so I'm also missing this mentor. So I'm also trying to think, do I have enough of a handle on Anishinaabe thought that I could learn something from the land without him? I don't have, normally I would be like, hey, I thought I was out on the snowmobile and I thought of this centering idea. And he would be like, you think too much. Our stories were not meant for you to think them apart, Leanne. So I didn't have that this time. But as I sort of dove also into the science and sort of understood that the first thing that a snowflake does when it falls from the sky world onto the land is physically bond to its neighboring snowflake, that became instructive in terms of how we should live or how we could be living. That sort of led me to start to think about Anishinaabe politics and Anishinaabe governance as systems of care. And I think those are things that I should have probably understood much earlier. And I think that there's many different ways that you could have come to those understandings. But for me, it was thinking about that snow. It was packing down the snow, mechanically centering it, and thinking about the snow's embodied practice and what I could learn about life on this planet from that.
There are so many great examples and stories and discussions of centering throughout the book, and it almost speaks to a kind of ebb and flow that literally takes its inspiration from water, from Nibi, right? In some senses, I want to know this book as a theory of because it's specific to Nishnaabeg worldview and the language, Nishnaabenwen. And for Kanaka Maoli, for Hawaiians, those are really important practices. But Nevertheless, sometimes our practices as Indigenous peoples, communities, nations can become challenging internally insofar as to make it difficult to relate, to perhaps center and build relations of solidarity with other communities, whether communities of all kinds. And I want to go back to the opening story that I shared about how in um, October 2023, you, Glenn Coulthard, myself, and Nick Estes really tried to put our heads together in bringing along other Indigenous peoples in our own communities and nations, institutions, grassroots organizers, activists, artists, to stand in support unequivocally with Palestinians. Those that are resisting and those that are world making, whether in Gaza, the West Bank, or elsewhere. So, can you talk a little bit about your own, perhaps, centering with Palestinian peoples, intellectuals? Maybe you want to say a little bit more about your time in Palestine with folks like Eve Ewing, who's a colleague of mine at the Department of Race, Diaspora, and Indigeneity, but also others that you made relationships with in Palestine, and how that has impacted the way you've written this book, in thinking very specifically with the genocide taking place, but also with the resistance and support. You know, at the University of Toronto, you came to our student encampment and talked with students one afternoon that I remember very specifically. So can you talk a little bit more about centering in a time of genocide as Indigenous people?
I think one of the things that I learned from water, from Nishnaabeg in this book, is that every living organism on the planet has a relationship with water. Water is inside of us, it's outside of us. It's the same amount of water that was here at the beginning of the world is still here, cycling. Water changes form, it transforms. And different cultures of the world have different pieces of knowledge in terms of water. So one of the things about writing the theory of water and using a Nishnaabeg thought is it's not a complete theory at all, because it has to be more of an invitation. And I wanted the book to feel like an invitation because I don't know anything about the ocean. I would need you and your people to understand the ocean. And I think that there's lots and lots of examples of that. So I think that really is reinforced in this idea that life is a network. And for Anishinaabe, in Anishinaabe thought, that network is made up of relationships, and you have to constantly be renewing, nourishing, replenishing, attending to that kind of relationality. And so solidarity in that way becomes a daily practice. It becomes a moment to moment practice. You're always trying to take care of and form a bond with different forms of life and different people that you're sharing time and space with. And so that idea, that kind of Anishinaabe idea of how to live in the world, I think took me out of Anishinaabe territory. And it got me interested in sort of anti-colonial organizing and anti-colonial networks, and it got me interested in also what's going on inside my territory with, in 2020 with this beautiful uprising of Black life that was global. And it got me, I think, thinking and breathing and living in a different way. In 2023, I went to Palestine as part of the Palestine Festival of Literature, which is a traveling festival. And the purpose of that festival, I think, for the international writers is you travel Palestine as Palestinians would have to travel. So you come in through Jordan across the Allenby Bridge. And I was the only Indigenous writer in that delegation that year, but Nick Estes had been a few years before. But it was, as many Indigenous people who've been to Palestine say, it's this you can see all of the different forms of colonialism and sort of the 400 years that led to genocide and the dispossession of my people from our land in the course of a week. And so it was, on one hand, very affirming, and I was expecting it to feel very different and unfamiliar to me because I hadn't been to the Middle East before, because I hadn't been in that sort of environment. And it felt very familiar, very home-like. And I knew that many of the Palestinians that were on the delegation that also I had met, I now have responsibilities to. So 2 years ago, when the Gaza genocide was accelerated, that I think showed me that I also had responsibilities in that moment.
Just to speak of another example of a similar narrative that what you just described reminded me of is I have really just amazing colleagues in Navajo territory in the Southwest, because I went to grad school at the University of New Mexico with folks like Nick Estes and Melanie Yazzie, and was a student organizer with the Red Nation. And Melanie Yazzie and another colleague of mine, Demetrius Johnson, both just incredible Diné thinkers and organizers, Demetrius in his own right. And in the acceleration point after Al-Aqsa flood, they both described the experience of watching live streamed the removal, the forced removal of Palestinians in Gaza from the north to the south, as one reminiscent of Diné and Navajo people's forced removal to Fort Sumner, away from their territory and their homeland, Diné Bikya, to the east, and the starvation, the outright killing, the deaths that happen along the way, and then the return. And so I do think that it's very clear, and I think we agree on this, that there is an important comparative point to make, that settler colonialism doesn't just happen in North America, and it doesn't just happen in Palestine, but how do we move forward together with not just the analysis, but with different tools to relate and see our struggles as interconnected. And I think that is what Palestine is showing us. And I really want to just mahalo you again, like I do with Glenn, like I do with Nick, for pulling me into that conversation to do that hard work, because it wasn't easy. There were Hawaiian Zionists, there were Nishnaabeg Zionists, there were, all sorts of folks coming out of the woodwork to degrade and defame that important centering that I think we were attempting to do in that moment. And so the images, whether one goes to Palestine or not, strike a chord, especially in the mind and heart of Indigenous peoples, but not exclusively. And I do want to bring up another area of centering, which we talked about, that I think is especially pertinent and prescient for this moment here in Chicago. This afternoon, I saw a photo of a young Black child outside of the South Shores apartment building on the south side of Chicago, zip-tied by an ICE, what I believe was an ICE agent, Immigration Customs Enforcement agent. And it reminded me of the kinds of carceral tactics that the IOF has used against Palestinian children. Just seeing that image and thinking about other images in my head. And then I was reminded of a comrade of mine saying that in Chicago, we're seeing the Israelification of police and the military. And Ricardo Gamboa, if you know him, is who said that. And it really struck me to think about how to read this text and learn with you to consider centering in such an important valence here, while there are potentially 400 Texas National Guard members being deployed into the city of Chicago by the Trump administration. And so the question is really about how do you see centering in relation to the rise of fascism, not just in the United States, but also perhaps in Canada, a place that we might not consider as having fascist tendencies, but as we know, is certainly no stranger to the exercise of spectacular violence through all kinds of executive force.
Yeah, it's certainly been interesting in Canada to have been through this government-sponsored Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and we're so sorry for residential schools, we're so sorry for genocide, da 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 da, and then the situation in Palestine, where our government is still supporting Israel, still sending arms, performatively recognizing a Palestinian state, but materially still supporting Israel. So I think that's been quite a trip. I want to go back to the student encampments, though, because I think that was a really, really powerful and beautiful point of resistance, of persistence, and of an incredible knowledge generation. When I went to the student encampment at the University of Toronto, these students were incredibly organized. There was healthcare, there was education, there was food, there was water, there were different faiths holding services. There was an incredible system of care that was enacted in these encampments. This was the world that I wanted to live in. This is the world that I've been writing about. And I didn't want to read students' essays where they were forced to read my text, but here they were embodying, I think, what so many of us have been writing about. And here was the institution just pummeling them, not seeing this incredible scaling up and generating the kinds of theory that we need to build the alternative. And I see that in all kinds of sites of resistance in here and in Canada. That centering is happening all the time right now on the south side of Chicago. And because activists are organizing, we are learning more skills. We're building the alternative as we're pushing back. And so I think looking at those as important theoretical sites is also really important. I think that we're in a really, really, really difficult moment right now. A moment that I remember meeting Palestinians in Palestine and having them say, this is the laboratory, this is the training ground, this is coming for you.
Yeah.
And so I think this process of centering across difference, of building bonds, of organizing different forms of mutual aid, of building care systems, is a world building practice. It's how we figure out how to weave ourselves into the world in a way that doesn't destroy life and in a way that doesn't destroy the planet. It's very, very difficult work. World making is struggle. I think a lot of our ancestors knew that struggle. And I think we're talking a lot about whether it's transatlantic slavery, whether it's the situation in Palestine, whether it's colonialism in Indigenous communities. These are very specific. They have specific histories. They have specific, there's a specificity to them that's important. But I think there's also some linked commonalities. And I think the process of centering is seeing those differences and acknowledging those differences and supporting each other through those differences and finding the commonalities as well.
I want to stay on the topic for just a moment longer, because there's just really powerful moment in the book where you're still thinking with Robin D.G. Kelley about anti-fascism, and it reminded me of kind of the blockade and things that you and Glenn have written about with Indigenous blockades of oil and gas infrastructure as being constructed in news or by politicians as negative, reactionary, unhelpful for the public. But in reality, as you and Glenn have put it, these are positive affirmations of Indigenous ways of being and thinking, of legal traditions, and of community building for a different way of living in this world. And I think that there is a tone in the remark about needing to be off on the offense with anti-fascism, as you put it in a note that you took while listening to Robin during his interview. And I've been really thinking about that, especially in this current climate, not just in Chicago, but in LA and elsewhere, and in other parts of the world where fascism is increasing and on the rise. So I do want to ask the question of, what does that look like to you? And how can we not lose hope as those that are anti-fascist and engage in anti-fascist movements and practice, to continue to be on the offense, especially as we see the success of or unarrests here in the city of Chicago, where people are preventing ICE officers from disappearing and removing folks that they're attempting to detain. How do you see that offensive stance? And there's some ways that you might suggest that we continue the hope, the positive in this movement that has been painted not just negatively and reactionary, but criminalized as terrorism.
I would never sort of come into someone else's community and answer that question directly. But what I will say is that it's a miracle in a lot of ways, given the history of Anishinaabe people and the Kanaka Moale, that you and I are sitting here talking to each other, using bits of our language. Our ancestors had to work very, very hard through 400 years of pretty brutal violence for you and I to be here. And if I think of all the things they did, sometimes they fought back physically. Sometimes it was a parent breastfeeding or teaching a child a certain story, or maybe just making sure that we had enough to eat to survive. Maybe it was simpler than that. But all of those things working in concert got us here. Mm-hmm. And so I think that I look to people like Miriam Kaba, who is saying, get your two friends together and do something. Do something that's in your community, that's meaningful to you, that pushes back in some way. Maybe it's organizing with the library. Maybe it's writing. Maybe it's making zines. Maybe it's helping your neighbors with childcare or food security. It doesn't have to be huge, but we all need to do something based on our risk tolerance, based on our gifts, based on the resources that we have. So fight, I think, can look different for different people, but I think it's sort of all hands on deck. We all need to find the way to contribute and the way to push back. I think it's really easy in moments like this to, because there's so much violence and so much trauma, to freeze. Because that's a very normal response, is to freeze. But I think collectively we have to encourage each other to make hope and inspiration a practice, not just an emotion, and to figure out how to take care of each other. And that's going to look different for different people. But I think we can't just sit back. Now is not the time to be complacent. I think that that's really clear.
Please join me in a big round of applause for Leanne Simpson and for Theory of Water.
Hello.
Miigwech.
I feel like that was not surface. We really got into the thick of things. So thank you for that.
My pleasure.
I'm just sweating.
So we have time for some questions from the audience, and I believe we have about 20 minutes for questions. So instead of us continuing to talk, just in our own conversation amongst ourselves, which was lovely and it's been an honor. Thank you so much. We'd like to open it up and ask if anybody has any questions for Leanne about the book.
Thank you so much. I was really struck by your thoughts about shorelines and difference and accountability and consent. And I'm wondering if there's a lesson that you or us collectively can take from that kind of relationships, specifically when it comes to accountability for harm that might have been caused among people who are, related somehow or have this connection that we want to preserve. What does that like? What does that look like? I know it's different for every situation and context, but I would just love your thoughts on that specific kind of interaction.
So I think I'm thinking back to Nishnaabeg elders, and I'm thinking that what I learned was that accountability is mostly about managing yourself. And when you have communities where everybody is very concerned about how they're behaving and how that's impacting different relationships, then the accountability is something that happens minute to minute, day to daily. It's not just when someone calls you out. It's you continually thinking in every moment, in every interaction, did I handle that well? Was I respectful? Did I hurt anyone's feelings? Not in like a spiraling way that can get out of control with anxiety, but in a way that's a daily practice, a daily collective practice. And so people are constantly, I think, repairing and asking for consent, and it becomes a daily practice where we're all kind of making mistakes and figuring out how to repair. I think it got really messed up with the violence of colonialism on our bodies, with the colonial gender binary, with heteropatriarchy, with transphobia, that all kind of came and messed up a whole bunch of relationships. But that's the part that I go back to, thinking about accountability, how I'm accountable to all of the different relationships that I'm in on a minute to minute, hour to hour, daily basis, and then talking collectively about how we embody that.
Osiris, and thank you so much for being here and giving this beautiful talk. I have yet to read the book. I'm number 17 on the hold list at the library. But I am curious to your thoughts about AI and its waste of water. And with the theory of water, I imagine you have some incredible wisdom or feelings, big feelings to share. And that was just my question is like, how do you feel about the relationship of water? Because you were saying everything is related to water. AI is now part of that. So I'm curious about your takes. Thanks.
It's been very interesting, I think, as an educator to watch the switch between this happened so quickly between how are we going to prevent students from cheating to how can we use AI to build curriculum and to build my course syllabi. That was really fast. University administrators. I don't know. I value thinking and I value the thinking of living things. And I think that our relationality is based on our thinking and on our sharing it, our thinking and our feeling and our sharing it with other species and with other humans. And I think that's the fabric of life. And I think we didn't all get together and decide that AI would be a great thing. It was a few fascist tech bros in a capitalist system that have forced us down our necks at a breakneck speed. So I'm a little skeptical. I'm a little mad at how fast it's infiltrated my life without my consent and without any sort of accountability. Yeah.
I also am waiting to read the book, but I read the As We've Always Done book, and I'm still getting through it because it's a really deep text and I really appreciate. Um, you touched on the concept of inviting people into the work that you do, and knowing that we're all healing in various ways from colonialism and everything else. I imagine different people are in different phases for receiving that invitation. So knowing that there is a spectrum of invitations people can receive in your experience and what you learned from others, how do you navigate that?
One of the, I think, gifts in my life is that most of my educational experiences have taken place on the land and children are also present. And so I've learned a lot from children. When you invite children to contribute or to think alongside you, which is something that I've learned from Black feminists, they, until they're a certain age, they share pretty openly about what they think on that spectrum. And sometimes what they've shared has stopped me in my tracks and made me think of the world in a different way. So it's not, when I think about my own life and I think of what's inspired me or what I've learned from, it's not always the people who have done the most research. It's not always the people who have written the most books. Sometimes it's a snowflake. Sometimes it's a kid looking at a turtle in a different way. And I feel like really grateful for that. So I think what's important is the invitation. I don't think, and the ability to be able to share your experience in life and how you experience the world. I think that's the most important part. It's not how much you know. Yeah. Thank you.
Forest Indigenous Cause. My name is Forrest.
Bonjour.
Thank you. Thank you for your talk. I just kind of wanted to ask a follow-up question on like the role of children. Myself and a few other people in this room are educators and like work with children here in Chicago, and think a lot about what it means to like theorize with children, and like in a way that both like takes seriously their ability as like thinkers to like think deeply about like while also not like, burdening them with colonial trauma. So I'm kind of wondering like how you kind of think about and approach balance and like what a theory of water might is about that.
So I've learned a lot from my kids in that regard. And my youngest is now in third year gender studies. So I'm still learning a lot from her. And sometimes I think what kids need is that affirmation, someone to listen, someone to see their experiences and to hear their theory. And what I've learned from my kids is that they don't always need the professor's lecture on colonialism. In fact, maybe they never need it. Maybe they get very sick of it. So I think that I've learned to put my energy into creating, educators are world builders because you're building a learning community, right? And so build an incredible, awesome, nurturing, inspiring learning community. And I think that what I've learned is that if you do that and you also are attentive to things like power and violence and all of the isms that are happening in our world, then there will be opportunities where you can empower the students to make connections, to do their own research, to solve problems in your learning community in a way that's anti-colonial and anti-fascist, and a way that rejects heteropatriarchy and transphobia and all of those things. So I think what I've learned is less lectures, more tools, more affirmation, more love and nurturing.
Question from the stream. I was wondering if you could say a little bit about who are some of the artists that you look to as teachers and how their art impacts you.
The one in the book that I speak a lot about is Rebecca Belmore, who is an Anishinaabe artist. And in the book, I talk about how in 1990, after the so-called Oka crisis in Canada, which was a Mohawk uprising to protect their sacred pines and burial grounds from the expansion of a golf course. It was, I think, one of the largest mobilizations of the Canadian Army. And in the wake of that, Rebecca built this huge megaphone that was an installation. She traveled across Canada and pulled this huge megaphone to reserves, to blockades, to sites of resistance, and people could go up. People gathered. There were kids, there were elders, there was food, and people could speak directly to the land in an amplified way. So she made this piece where, in the wake of this sort of collective trauma that Indigenous people were facing, she gave us a voice and she gave us an opportunity to build community. Then in 2017, she made kind of siblings to speaking to their mother, which was the name of that first piece. And it was called Wave Sound, and they were huge conical earpieces that were giant, and they were installed on the shore. And so from 1991, where we were speaking to the land, 2017, we're listening to water. And so that piece, along with a poem from Nomenclature, written by Dion Brand, were kind of pivotal into making me ask questions about what does it mean if we collectively listen to water. Yeah, so I think those two pieces were important.
We have about 5 more minutes. Can take a few more questions.
And I'm also an anti-fascist. And whenever I think about the genocide, I feel the water is too small or small, trivial. I keep telling myself I should think about both, but it's really difficult for me to think about both in multiple scales. So to be anti-fascist, but also to think about the snowflakes and then the water and then the environment. Could you share us a little bit of the lesson from your elders, how to do that and how to keep living through?
I think that in Anishinaabe thought, we're constantly moving across scales. So I think my ancestors were really good at that. And that's difficult for us in contemporary times. That's difficult for me. But what I see practiced when we were talking about accountability at the shoreline, what I see individuals practicing, I would see practiced in families. And then those same sorts of teachings and ethics and politics practiced in larger communities and practiced in bigger collectivities. And I think that's the same with the snowflake. When you think of the fantastically large impact that a blizzard can have over a large geographic area. So when snowflakes act en masse, when they're organized and a whole bunch of them together decide to do one thing, it's an incredible results on a large scale. So I don't know the answer to that question, but I think we should all think about that in January during the first blizzard.
And just that stuff took me a lot as like a perspective of like freedom from what, like what does it mean to like have freedom as this concept, like how would we even understand it if we weren't unfree? And like I would just be interested in hearing more of like kind of your perspective on that like idea, or that like how we think about worlds where, you know, where like kind of our whole concept of freedom might be different, especially in a moment where I think it's pretty easy to feel very unfree and to see what we want to be free of.
Yeah, freedom makes a lot of sense to us right now in this moment, right? I was, and Maddie Weetung was also doing this work. We were trying to, because Doug was a fluent speaker, he understood Anishinaabe-Moan in a really important and vital way. So our language is made up mostly of verbs and not nouns. Our language was evolved, and is designed to communicate our world view. And so when we were asking him these questions, we're asking him actually to think through grammatically inside of our language for the concept of freedom. And so this language was designed by people who saw themselves in a deeply relational network. And so when he says freedom from what, he knows it's freedom from colonialism, it's freedom from transatlantic slavery, it's freedom from anti-blackness, it's freedom from transphobia. He knows what we're asking, but he's trying to think through what that looks like in a pre-colonial sort of way where those things don't exist and where life for our people is bound up in how they treat all of the other beings that they're in relationship with. So he's saying freedom from what? The responsibility that I have to you, the responsibility that I have to my kids, the responsibility that I have to the moose or the beaver or the water. Freedom from what? And so that, I think, to both Maddie and I was, I don't think we were expecting that answer. And that required us to have a deeper understanding, I think, of Anishinaabe thought and how our people lived. And so, yeah, I wanna recreate a world where we have so many complex systems of caring for each other and the planet that somebody asks us what the word for freedom is, and we freedom from what? Yeah.
Please join me in giving Leanne another round of applause.
I want to thank you for that gorgeous conversation and for your deep reading. I want to thank Haymarket, who have been amazing as a publisher. And I really, really want to thank all of you for coming during these terrible times to be together with us tonight and to think a little bit about the kinds of worlds we can build together. Miigwech.